Hi there. Thanks for joining me on this opportunity to share my story with you. I know there are people that have heard my story before, but this might be your first time hearing my story. And I hope that by the time I'm done telling you a little bit about my life, that it'll bring you encouragement and actually give you hope to do more with your life. My story is very unique. And when I was going through it as a kid, I had no idea why it was happening to me. It made no sense. And so every time I get to share it now, I realize there was a purpose for what I went through. And so today, I'm thankful for where I am, but I'm always encouraged anytime I get an opportunity to share my story. So that's why I'm doing this. I hope today encourages you. Let's start from the beginning, because for a lot of people like me, my beginning was very difficult. And I know now that there are a lot of people that have similar circumstances. Some are worse, some are better, but it's different for everyone. And so I want to share with you a little bit about where I came from and where I am today, and hopefully give you enough principles, enough things that can help you to gradually get out of your situation. Mine starts with my parents, who came from Monterrey, Mexico. They came as a young couple. My mom and dad got married at 17 and 16 years old. My dad was legal in both the United States and Mexico, so when he married my mom, he was able to come here to the United States, and she became a legal resident. I was born in 1961. I was born in San Antonio, Texas, and to be honest with you, I had obviously no idea what my life would be. My dad came from a very successful family. His side of his father was very successful, had money, had wealth, had a lot of acknowledgement in his city. And so my dad, as a young man, had pretty much everything he wanted. My mother, on the other hand, came from a family of 13 kids. She was very typical for what you would find in a low-income area in Monterrey, Mexico. Monterrey, by the way, is 3 hours south of the border of Texas and is a major city, kind of like Chicago. But anyways, she grew up in a really poor family. She was the oldest of all the girls and third in line. And she quit school at an early age. 7th grade, she dropped out to work to help feed the family. And so my mom only had a 7th grade education. But she was an amazing woman. She was funny. She was fun. She had a great personality. She was a beautiful woman. And my dad noticed that. And they ended up dating and then getting married young. Now, what's interesting is both sides, both families, were against the marriage. My mother's side of the family really didn't trust my dad. They felt like he was a rich kid. He didn't care about her. He was just kind of messing around with her. And his side of the family looked at my mom like a tramp, like literally, you know, this low-income, desperate young girl trying to marry into wealth. And so they were both against the marriage. But my mom and dad loved each other, and they went to their families and said, we're going to do this with or without your support, which I think is a huge mistake. A lot of young people just react and fight authority, their parents or whatever, to make their own decisions. But for whatever reason, they decided to get married, and both families, maybe just to look like they were doing the right thing, had the wedding, and they sent my mom and dad off. And when they came to the United States in the 60s, let me tell you, the United States was a mess back then. There was a lot of controversy. There was a lot of racism. There was a lot going on. And I was born in 1961, and my dad struggled. Yeah, in Mexico, my dad had a nice house and a dad who paid for everything. But now he was in the United States, and he couldn't get a job. He didn't have a high school degree or college degree. He didn't have anything. So now he was desperate. Now, my dad was bilingual, so he spoke English and Spanish, but he still struggled. My mom spoke no English, and here she is as a 16-year-old, married, and this guy can't get a job. We ended up moving in with a family, a few other families, in a little apartment, and there were like all these people living together, and we struggled. Eventually, my dad got a job driving bulldozer in construction. He was a construction worker, and but he struggled. We couldn't pay our bills, and eventually we got our own apartment. But I'll tell you where it went bad for us. I was probably about 5 years old. My dad couldn't make enough money, so he started selling drugs. And he found out that literally selling drugs in 1 week, he could make what he could make in a whole month. So from there, my dad started selling drugs on a regular basis. And it got crazy. It got to the point where when my dad was not only selling drugs, he was using drugs. And then eventually my dad thought he was smart enough that he would keep profits that he owed to the people that were supplying him. So people were supplying drugs to him and he wasn't giving all the money. He was keeping part of the portions for him. And that really messed things up. Eventually, my dad had people after him for the money. Eventually, there were people knocking on our door, policemen, the law enforcement was coming after him. Even drug users. There were a lot of people that were using the drugs that my dad was selling to that were desperate. And so literally, I remember 6 months later, my dad just waking us up in the middle of the night and saying, we gotta go, we gotta move. And we just moved. We started in San Antonio, Texas, and then we moved to another place down in southern Texas in like Brownsville. But what got really crazy was that my dad's anger, my dad's temperament completely changed. Suddenly, he had a wife and a few kids. By the time my mom was 22, she had 4 kids. I was the oldest, and then my brother Louis, Tony, and Gracie. And now my mom, here she is, still doesn't speak English. She's 22, living with this guy that's crazy. And we're moving all over the place. And he became very violent. Now, his anger was not brought on by his substance abuse. It wasn't because he drank or because he smoked marijuana. It wasn't because of that. That stuff just made his anger worse. It made his life worse. He already had emotional problems. And this is what I tell a lot of people. You have to deal with the hurt in your life. You have to deal with rejection in life, the anger in your life. You have to deal with it because if you don't, you'll turn to substance thinking that'll help you, and it won't. As a matter of fact, what it'll do is it'll make it worse. Those substance abuse just amplifies everything you're doing. So my dad was out of control, and every 6 months we started moving. From when I was 5 years old till I was 10, we never lived in the same place, and it was tough on me. All the time, we were running from the police, we were running from drug users, we were running from everybody. And you can imagine for me, as a kid, I had no stability. I mean, I'm in an education system, I can't speak the language, and every time we move, I'm in a new classroom. I can't tell you how many times I sat in a chair in a classroom and everybody just laughed at me. You know, kids don't mean to be mean, but they are. And I didn't have nice clothes, and I smelled a bit, and I was different, and so kids would, make fun of me or throw things at me and shoot spit wads at me, and it was tough. I hated those kids. Meanwhile, then I'd go home on a bus, and I'd get home to my mom and dad, and my mom would be, fighting with my dad. My dad would beat her up, and then he'd beat us up, and I hated life. By the time I was 6 or 7, I hated life. I hated school, I hated people, I hated my dad. It was a really difficult time. I thought it would never end, to be honest with you. And one day my dad came home. I was 10, so we've been going through this for 5 years. And one day at 10 years old, like many nights, my dad would come home completely drunk. And he'd come home and he'd wake us all up, and my mom would get up and we'd all sit on the couch, and my dad would go, I'll never forget him. He'd be like, hey, I got good news for you. Guess what? Someone's going to help us. And he would say this every time we were going to move. Someone's going to help us. And we get our car in the middle of the night and we drive to a new town. We went from San Antonio to Brownsville. We crossed the border to Mexico, up to Houston. We were all over Texas, always running for our lives. So I was sick and tired of him telling us, someone's going to help us. I have good news. Good news became bad news to me every time I heard him say it. But this time was different. He said, listen, I got a friend in Chicago who's going to help us. This guy's going to help us. He says there's work in Chicago. And my dad was a welder, and he says, yeah, there's jobs to weld, and it's going to be great. And so one night, middle of the night, Houston, Texas, 1972, we got in our station wagon, and we drove to Chicago. And by this time, my mom had 5 kids. Eventually, my mom would have 6 kids. I'd be the oldest of the 6. But we drove to Chicago, and I'll never forget, it was February. When we got to Chicago, it was 10 below zero. It's the first time I ever saw snow. And I got to be honest with you, it was kind of cool. I mean, looking out your window and everything's white. It looked like there was ice cream everywhere. I remember just being like, wow, this is amazing. We had never experienced cold weather. We were always moving in Texas, so it was always warm. We left Houston, where it was like 75 degrees, and we arrived in Chicago 24 hours later, and it was 10 below zero. And the hard part was, my dad, I will never forget, it was like 1 or 2 in the morning. My dad was driving, my mom was in the passenger seat. She had the baby, little Ricky was in her hands. And then me, Louie, and Tony, and Gracie were in the back seat. We were all sleeping because it was like 2 in the morning. I remember my dad parking, and he gets out of the car and he starts walking up to the house. This is the guy that's going to help us. This is a guy just 2 weeks ago who said, Matt, come to Chicago, there's a lot of work. So my dad goes up to the door, and I remember kind of clearing the ice from the window and seeing my dad. Because you know, when you're abused, when you're an abused kid, you always know where your abuser is. So I always kept an eye on my dad. And so I looked as I saw my dad walk into the house, but I was looking around at the trees and the snow, and it was beautiful. And I'll never forget the feeling. My dad knocked on the door and nobody came. And he knocked on the door and nobody showed up. Then I could see my dad pulling the hair on his head, and he was getting angry. It's something I'm very familiar with as a kid. My dad stepped off the stoop of the house and walked over to the window and tried to see if he could see anyone. He knocked on the window and no lights, nobody's coming out. It's 2 in the morning. Now he's back by the door and he's pounding on the door and he's punching the air and he's like grabbing his hair, and finally a light comes on and a little Mexican woman, I just saw her kind of poke her head out, and she shook her finger, and then the door closed, and my dad turned around and I could see the anger in his face. And for me as a kid, immediately I was like, oh my God. Every time my dad acted like that, he was going to hit us. He was going to beat us. I mean, here we are, we're just these kids under control of this man is completely abusive and out of control. My dad gets back to the car and he gets in the car and he shuts the door, and my mom wakes up and she goes, what's wrong? He goes, shut up, and he hits her. Blood goes against the window, and then think about this. He puts the car in drive in the winter, in the snow. Thank God it was 2 in the morning, and he just started driving like a crazy man. The 4 kids in the back, no seat belts, no chairs. My mom's holding on to the baby, and he's driving like a maniac. He had a bunch of parked cars. He was so angry. And I know why my dad was angry. Because he wanted to change. He wanted to be different. He thought going to Chicago would maybe change his whole life. But when he got there, the person that promised to help him was gone. See, so many times in life, we get our hopes up. Someone says, I'll help you. Someone says, I'll be there for you. And then those people let you down. And that's what had happened. My dad was really trying to change. But the person that was going to help him let him down. And you want to know why? Because we are who we associate with. Every time I speak in high schools, I tell kids this. I said, look, if you want to be different, you got to hang out with different people. You have to associate with different types of people. You can't stop smoking or drinking by hanging out with these kids and go to kids that are doing the same thing. My dad, the guy that was going to help him, was a drug dealer. He went from drug dealers in Texas to a drug dealer in Chicago. And guess what? He wasn't there to help us because he was arrested a week before. That's why the woman said no. He wasn't there. The guy that was going to help us was arrested for dealing drugs. If you're going to change something in your life, then you got to change the people you hang out. You got to change your environment. It was a hard lesson, but guess what? About 20 minutes later, my dad pulls into this bar, the only thing open. And it was in the little west suburbs of Chicago, a little town called West Chicago, Illinois, off of Route 64 North Avenue. And he pulls into this bar. My dad loved me, and he says, Juan, come up here. And I kind of leaned up on the seat of the station wagon. He goes, you love your dad? I said, yeah, Dad, I love you. He goes, you believe in me? I go, yeah, Dad, I believe in you. He goes, I'm going to go inside. I'm going to see if I can get some help. Maybe they can tell me somewhere where we can go spend the night. I said, okay, Dad. But you know what my dad did? He went in that bar and he started drinking. It's his old habit. It's his addiction. That's how he thinks. He thinks drinking will make him think clearer. Well, he goes in and drinks. And by the way, he leaves a woman and 5 kids in 10 below zero. And by the way, we don't have boots or jackets or gloves or hats. We're wearing the clothes we just came from in Houston 24 hours ago. So we're sitting in the station wagon and half an hour goes by and my mom finally can't stand it. We're trembling. And she goes, Juan, here's the baby. And she handed me back the little baby Ricky. I said, Mom, where are you going? She goes, it's okay. She opened the door, closed her door, and then she opened our door. And then she said, okay, give me the baby, Juan. I mean, my mom's standing outside. And she goes, Juan, lay down in between the seats. Now, back then in the 70s, station wagons were huge. So between the seat and the front seat, there was a lot of room. So I laid down. And then she put Louie on one side of me. And then she put Tony. And then she put my sister. And then my mom laid on top of all of us. And I'm on the bottom going, what are we doing, Mom? And she goes, somewhere, you know, I read like chickens, like the big fat chicken. She lays on the little chickens and she keeps them warm. And she did. Do you know that that night my mom kept us warm? Yeah, she did. She created heat for us. Do you know that my dad drank for 2 hours and left us out there in the cold? And my mom laid on us. She laid on us for an hour and a half, keeping us warm. Do you know to this day, my mom is in her 70s, her entire back hurts anytime it's cold out. Because that night she was severely frostbitten. Her entire backside was frozen. She sacrificed her life to keep her kids warm. You know that I've heard a saying say that there is no greater love than when a person lays down their life for another. My mom's my hero. She laid down her life for me. At like whatever time my dad comes out of the bar and he gets in the car, he's completely drunk. Something I'm very used to. He goes, Juan, come here, mijo. Mijo means son. He goes, you believe in your dad? I said, yeah, Dad, I believe in you. You love me? I go, I do, Dad. He goes, this guy says there's a farm down the street. He says nobody lives there. He goes, we're going to go there. And you know what, Johnny? He called me Johnny, which is Juan. We're going to go there for like a couple days. Then I'm going to find us a house. I'm going to get a job. I'm going to change. You're going to be proud of me. And I'll never forget, we drove down about a half a mile. And on the side of the road there was an entrance to a farmhouse way back there. And we started driving down. We got stuck in the snow because the snow was a couple feet high and the car couldn't even make it. So we walked the rest of the way to that farmhouse. And here's the crazy part. When we got to the front of the house, the thing was just a deserted mess. It was a shack. Broken windows. The porch was broken. There was no, the front door was just kind of hanging on a hinge. My dad kicked it open. There were rats. There were cockroaches. My dad said, we're going to live here for a few days and then I'll find us a house. And I want you to look at me. I'm your speaker today. We didn't live there for 3 days. We lived there for 3 years. 3 years. No running water, no electricity, no food for many days. We were starving to death. It was horrible. And I'll never forget, my dad eventually did get a job, but he stayed in that house because we were living there for free. We eventually put up a few curtains and we did a few other things. But eventually, we just kept living there. And I'll never forget, we got there in February, and in August, my mom grabs us and says, come on, let's go. My mom, myself, my brother Louie, Gracie, Tony, and the baby. The baby was strapped to my mom with like a blanket. We didn't have a little backpack that she could carry the kid, nothing like that. And here's my mom with this little baby strapped to her with 4 little kids, and she's walking down a 4-lane highway, Route 64, 55 miles an hour, and we're on the gravel walking. I go, Mom, where are we going? She goes, we got to find a school for you. And I said, oh, no, Mom, I don't want to go to school. People hate us. We don't speak the language. We smell. No, Mom, I don't want to go. She goes, you have to go to school. My mom's amazing. She only went to the 7th grade, but she knew you need schools. If you're going to be different, you have to go to school. And sure enough, we ended up walking about 3 miles and we found a little elementary school. I remember when we got there, the people were blown away when we walked in. We were so dirty. Believe this or not, we were still wearing the clothes in August. We were still wearing the clothes that we came from Houston in February. 8 months later, we were still wearing the same clothes. We smelled terrible. We haven't showered. It was just horrible. And I remember that the people at the school were like, oh my, who are you? My mom couldn't speak English. Nobody could help us. And this woman comes up, she goes, you know, in her best Spanish, un minuto, please, un minuto. And my mom just starts crying. I'm like a 10-year-old. I'm like, what's wrong, Mom? Why are you crying? She goes, because nobody understands us. I hate your father. Why doesn't anyone understand us? And so my mom couldn't speak English. So in my best English, I say, hello, my name is Juan. And she goes, oh, you speak English? I go, a little bit, you know, a little bit. And she goes, oh, okay, Juan. And I said, we come from a long place. We come from a long place, and my mom would like to go to school here. Because I told her, because I know one thing, I'm not going to school. I don't like school, but she wants us to go to school so she can go to school. And the next part was really difficult. The woman brought us into a room, and she started kind of dusting us off. We all had lice. We were so dirty. They took off our clothes and kind of washed us a little bit. And then they put our clothes back on, and then one by one, they took us to different classrooms. Now, I can't tell you what my sister and my brothers went through, but let me tell you for me. I went down the hallway to a classroom, and the principal couldn't even touch me. And when I got to the classroom, they knocked on the little window, and the teacher came up, and when she saw me, she went, oh. She was in total shock, because she just couldn't believe how bad I looked. And then what did she do? She did what every other teacher had done in my life. Every other teacher. She found a chair in the back of the room, and she put me there. And that's where I sat again. And I literally sat in that chair thinking, why am I alive? I hate life. I hate my dad. I hate people. So you're saying, well, Juan, where did it turn around for you? In that very school. I only lasted with that teacher for about 6 months, but the next year I started with a teacher called Mr. Laurie. And this was a man who had just started teaching, and I'll never forget him. He was a short guy with a little horn-rimmed glasses and high energy, and he was such a great teacher, and I got him as a teacher. And you know what he said? We're going to put Juan right up front. He didn't put me in the back of the class. He put a chair up front. Now, I'll be honest with you, I was a little nervous to sit up front, but he said, Juan's special. You know why? Juan speaks Spanish. That's his first language. And he's learning English. So we're going to learn from Juan, and he's going to learn from us. And he got all the kids excited. And suddenly people were interested in me. You know that Mr. Laurie even went outside and played kickball with me? He went out and watched me play and introduced me to the other kids. Every once in a while, Mr. Laurie would bring me a little fruit or something. And Mr. Laurie was the first person in my life who showed kindness, who took an interest in me. Before then, outside of my mom, I didn't have friends. No one ever showed me kindness or love. And Mr. Laurie did, and it impacted me. A few years later, a church came and rescued us because someone at the school worked for this church and said there's this really bad family living in an abandoned home, and they need help. And that church moved us from that home and gave us a home and gave us clothes, got my mom and dad jobs, and it was incredible. Our whole life was transformed. I never got to say bye to Mr. Laurie because literally they rescued us during the time in the summer, and so it was really difficult. And so I wished I would have been able to say bye to Mr. Laurie, but I never got to. But one thing for sure, he made an impact in my life. Now I want to take you forward to what happened. Eventually, I would get involved in a good high school, and I would get some tutoring, and I would get involved with sports. That church moved us to an area where there was a lot more resources. They were willing to help us with food and jobs and everything, and our life started to grow, and my dad never changed, by the way. My dad just kept doing what he was doing. Privately, he looked Publicly, he looked good. Privately, he was still drinking, doing drugs, and abusing us. But he fit into the community now because he could really play the role outside of it. But I didn't care. I got involved with church. I got involved with school. I got involved with sports. And I started to change. I started to become someone special. And I'll never forget my senior year in high school. My dad was finally arrested, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. And my dad ended up spending 18 years in prison. Now, I will tell you this. My dad and I would eventually become friends because every month for 18 years I went to visit my dad in prison. Many people say, why? Well, because he was my dad. And you know what? He wasn't perfect, but I learned a lot from his mistakes. And today I'm a person because I was able to avoid those mistakes as of him. I don't drink, I don't do drugs, I don't do any of that because I watch how it treated his life. If you're out there and you're caught on some substance, if you're addicted right now to alcohol or drugs or something else, gambling, you need help. What I did was I got help. I had a coach and teachers and mentors, and eventually I went to professional counseling that allowed me to get help. And so I would encourage you to do the same. Let me conclude this story by telling you what's happened. So I ended up going to college. I ended up meeting my wife in college. We dated all 4 years, and now we've been married 35 years. We have 5 amazing kids, all in their 20s and older, and my life is a miracle. It's just incredible. I've now been telling my story for 25 years. I've been speaking for over 25 years, and I've even written a book. I wrote a book about my life that you can find on Amazon. It's called Never Forsaken, the Juan Ortiz story. As a matter of fact, I just finished my second book that'll come out this summer. But I just want to tell you the coolest part of my story. So after marrying and having kids and my own home and finishing a college degree and getting all that, what happened to me about 10 years ago is amazing. I was speaking at this event, a large event, 300 people. And after I was done speaking, I got a standing ovation, and everybody goes, wow, your story is amazing. And a few days later, I got a call from a policeman. Because at that event, I told the story of my 5th grade teacher, Mr. Laurie. I told him I never got to say bye to Mr. Laurie. So I told that audience on behalf of Mr. Laurie, who I never got to thank, I want to thank all of you for what you do. So this policeman heard this story. He was really emotional about it. And a few days later, he called me. He goes, Mr. Ortiz, my name is so-and-so from the police department. And I'm like, I didn't do it. Whatever it wasn't me. And he goes, no, Mr. Ortiz. He goes, I heard your speech the other day. It was amazing. And I just want to let you know that I found Mr. Laurie. I was like, what? Are you kidding me? He goes, no, he never married. He still lives in the same place. He's still working with kids. He's still tutoring. I'm like, I don't know if he'll remember. He goes, oh, he does. I've already talked to him. He remembered you. He remembered your mom. He remembered your brothers and your sister. And Mr. Laurie would like to see you. So here's the blessing in my life. Literally 30 years later or I don't even know the number. Me and Mr. Laurie got to reconnect. The policeman drove me to his house. We walked in, and there was Mr. Laurie. He was still the same size, just a little short guy with the black rimmed glasses. And I said, Mr. Laurie, you look the same. And he goes, so do you, except you're a little fatter. And I was like, oh, Mr. Laurie. And he goes, no, you're a beautiful one. And we hugged, and we talked for hours, and we cried together. You know, the coolest part is Mr. Laurie and I got to spend the last 10 years of his life, because he passed away a few years ago. We got to spend the last 10 years of his life going to lunch once a month, and I learned so much from him. And here's my point to you. You never know what can happen in your life if you're willing to change. Anything's possible if you're willing to change. Look, if I can change from where I came from, imagine what you can do. Imagine how your life can change. There's just a few simple things. One is you got to believe in yourself. Find a reason to live. What is a purpose in life that you can live for? Second of all, you got to find mentors. You got to find people that can help you. Then sit down and have those mentors help you put a plan together for your life. Look, I want to make this special announcement at this because right now we're in a weird time. Our country, our world has never seen anything like this. And many people are dealing with depression. Many people are dealing with grief from losing a family member or losing a job. It's a really difficult time. And for all of us, it's confusing, it's overwhelming. And so I want to tell you, don't do life by yourself. The reason I am who I am today is because I allowed other people to help me. I was teachable and I was humble and I was willing to get help. And I would have never made it without a Mr. Laurie or my football coach or my wife Becky or so many other people that have loved me and are still loving me. If while you're watching this today, you are hurting, you're confused, you don't know what's next, what's important is to call people you trust and love and allow them to help you. I hope you were encouraged by my talk. I hope that something I said gives you the courage to go out and change your life even during this difficult time. I look forward to our next time together.